I'm coming to you from the land of the Wurundjeri and the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. And I want to start by paying my respects to elders both past and present, and recognise that I'm speaking to you on land that was never ceded. I run a charity called the Asylum-Seeker Resource Centre, Australia's largest independent human rights organisation for people seeking asylum and refugees, a charity I founded 20 years ago when I was 28. At the heart of my organisation and the work that I do for the last 2 decades has been trying to explain to people the refugee journey, trying to teach people empathy and compassion, to relate for a moment as to what it would be like to be separated from home, from family, to have your freedoms restricted, to fear for your safety and that of your family and community. That's a story that feels really universal right now, as COVID has separated us from our loved ones, from our community, from our dreams, our aspirations, our sense of safety and security. And what I hope comes from this pandemic is a more compassionate and kinder society rather than a harsher and crueler one. History will decide that. When COVID hit, I looked around me and saw most charities and businesses shutting their doors, cutting costs, laying off staff. I saw a society in panic. And I asked myself, what do I do now as CEO? I was feeling so overwhelmed myself. I was so scared. I was scared if I kept our doors open, that people could die. I was scared I was going to get COVID and pass it on to my mother. I was scared about how we were going to survive. What if we went under and couldn't help people anymore? We're an independent charity that on principle takes no money from the federal government. And during this pandemic, the Australian government has given people seeking asylum nothing. What was provided to other Australians to make sure they didn't go homeless and starve or find themselves doing at-risk work and placing their safety at risk. For the communities that we work with, the 7,000 people, through the more than 200 staff I have and the more than 1,300 volunteers, we were for many the only place they could turn to. So I want to talk through, well, what did we do next? It's March. I'm sitting there with my board and it looks really terrifying. It looks like by September of 2020, we're going to be $4.6 million in deficit, be facing having to sack 50% of our staff. It looks like by Christmas, we're probably going to go under and not even be able to keep our doors open for another year. We have a community of 7,000 people relying on us who have no support. Most have nowhere else to turn. So what do? This was the first important lesson I learned during this pandemic. Double down on your purpose, double down on your values, and double down on what you stand for. I remember sitting there talking to my board one night and going, I know what looks easy here. Let's lay people off, let's cut costs, let's keep our doors closed and stay safe. But what is the point of surviving this pandemic if the very things we stand for, if the very purpose that we claim we believe in, of being there for people seeking asylum and refugees in times of crisis, being that safety net for people, if we abandon that, if we forsaken that, what is the point of surviving this crisis? So the first thing we did was put people first and understand that if we're going to live our values, we need to do a couple of critical things. One, we kept our doors open when most closed them because we wanted to set the example and send a clear message to the refugees that we served, that we were there for them. If you can't be there for people as a charity in a once-in-a-century pandemic, then you don't deserve to survive. What is your point of even being here? Two, we didn't lay off our staff. There we were in March and we started by giving people a 6-week guarantee saying, look, we can promise you this to begin with, trying to provide some stability and security to people as we began. The next thing that we did was actually go, well, what is our clear roadmap ahead? People were anxious, people were scared. And so one of the first things we did as a leadership team, and one of the first things I did as a leader, was come up with a roadmap which had 4 simple goals. 1, we're going to meet the critical needs of refugees. That is, we're not going to turn people away. 2, we're going to keep our people safe. 3, we're going to be honest and transparent with our staff and try to give them as much job security and certainty as we could. And 4, we were going to commit ourselves to finding a way to financially survive this pandemic. So how do we do these things? Well, 1, by putting people first, that was about being vulnerable as a leader, about talking to staff and saying that I too was as scared as they were, that I didn't have all the answers, but that we had to find a way to keep our doors open. That the people we served, refugees, had nowhere else to go. We were their supermarket, their pharmacy, their roof over their head in this pandemic. And if we ran away, well, then what would happen to this community? The second thing we did was understand what were the critical sacrifices to make. And what we understood was it wasn't about sacrificing our staff and about doing what was easy, but about sitting in what was hard. So we asked our staff to make voluntary sacrifices, asked them if they could take a pay cut, asked them if they could reduce their hours, consulted with them heavily, and understood that as a CEO, one of the most important things that I needed to do through this pandemic was be a role model, set an example, as the leadership team had to do as well. Do not ask your staff to do that which you won't do yourself. So I voluntarily took a 50% pay cut. The leadership team all took what they could manage as well as pay cuts too. And we set the tone that we were in this together. Half the staff took a pay cut, made a sacrifice, half felt they weren't able to. All were treated with the same gratitude and respect, recognizing everyone had a different situation. But we owned that together. Faced with this massive cliff and deficit, we actually paused that which was non-essential, because what COVID taught us was that our people were essential. But we paused all the things that weren't, contracts that could wait, projects that could wait, things that were nice to have, like bonus days off, were paused and stopped. Above award conditions were brought back to national employment standards to actually go, these are the things that we can manage through, but what we don't want to do is throw any one of your families out into this pandemic, into this economy. We kept our people safe. All our moderate to high risk staff and volunteers were sent home to work remotely from home. And we found that was critical to keep people safe. And this was a tough one. All throughout the year, there was lots of pushback around, let us come back into the office. Why can't we come back into the office? And again, it was about having unvarnished conversations and going, if one of you dies, or if one of our members die, which is what we call our clients, and we have to front before a coroner's inquest, we front your family and explain why we let this happen, what would we say? So we kept going back to our values. We kept going back to our people. And we didn't apologize for that. We kept coming back to our roadmap as to why we're doing this. We had dozens of staff that suddenly had no work. And instead of laying them off, we redeployed them. And we consulted transparently, openly. One of the critical lessons was communicate, communicate, communicate. Be transparent, be values-led, and repeat, 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 so that people know why you're doing it. It's to keep everyone safe. It's to get everyone through this. It's to lead with our values. When we had our social enterprise staff of 50 refugees in our catering and cleaning businesses suddenly without work, we committed to keep paying their wages for the next 6 months. And we kept paying all through the pandemic, as we've had through multiple lockdowns, because it's simply ethically the right thing to do. When we saw we had 3 COVID cases last year in 2020 at work, and we took those as learning opportunities around making sure that we had in place paid pandemic leave to make sure that people weren't choosing between their work and feeding their family or finding themselves coming into work when they've got symptoms of COVID. And we made it a conversation to be proud of when people told us they needed to get tested, told us they needed to stay home, and made sure we made no difference between our casual and our permanent staff, that we were one team together. In June of 2020, we went back to our staff and actually gave them an employment guarantee for the entire year, saying, look, As long as we all share this accountability about making smart decisions, smart savings, and are disciplined, we want you to know that you're going to be safe. We're going to keep you safe. Back to March, when we're sitting there facing this extraordinary demand, as people were stockpiling their food and the supermarket shelves were running dry, we were facing the same challenges. And we went and tripled, committed millions of dollars we actually didn't have at the time into scaling up our housing, our food, our medical care, our emergency assistance, while keeping our doors open. And we made that commitment because for us, it was around going, well, if we're not going to spend our money now, then what the heck is it for? What's the point of having any savings as an organization that you're not going to use in a time like now? And through this pandemic, we committed to that money before we'd even fundraised it, because our key thing was lead with your values, do what is right, stand for what is important right now, and the public will follow. We ended up housing 283% more people, 4 times the demand of food came through, and we met that demand. We ended up feeding 10 other charities that didn't have food to keep them safe and to support their communities as well. And then in March, we went out with what I think was the first emergency appeal for COVID in Australia. And people were like, well, who's going to give to this? No one's going to donate to this at a time like now. We raised $3.12 million in 17 days because people were looking for leadership. And one of the big lessons of the time was authentic leadership, was about being brave to actually show we're open, we're here, we're not closing our doors. And innovation and agility were critical lessons about how do we build hybrid models? What was essential that we needed to keep running? And we use innovation like technology to stay connected to isolated people, outreach models. We leased a warehouse and delivered food to 600 families a week through a home delivery service so that people didn't have to choose between risking getting COVID and taking 2 hours to come in and feeding their families. And it worked. We started doing outreach to immunize people, to make sure they were at least vaccinated and immunized. We're not talking about even the COVID vaccine, just to make sure that we work with so many people who have compromised immune systems and wanted to make sure people were safe. We found ways digitally to send people medical prescriptions so they could get access to medicines, because so many of the people we work with have no income, no healthcare, no right to work. When the public housing towers in the heart of Melbourne were shut down and barricaded due to COVID, we redeployed our catering staff to go and make 6,000 culturally appropriate inclusive meals to go and feed the people trapped in those towers. For us, it was always about seize the opportunity. There is an opportunity here to show what we stand for, to lead with our values, to double down on our purpose and our mission, to make the right sacrifices, to protect our people, to protect our culture. And within this, at the same time, to keep thinking forward to the future. So we continue to build our new centre in Dandenong and didn't stop our works on that. We continued to actually invest in the organisation to ensure that we were strong for the long term. We kept engaging our donors and supporters through digital nights and through using Zooms. We kept our volunteers engaged, many of which had to make the sacrifice of staying home. And most importantly, helped keep people who had lost their jobs connected through using apps like Slack. People sitting us on that we're working with were the first to lose their jobs and are going to be the last to recover from this pandemic. So we looked at how do we get people back into work. We even partnered with the state government, and in the middle of the pandemic took on 106 people through a thing called Working for Victoria. And the refugees themselves helped us run the organisation and keep our doors open. 80% of those people have gone on to find permanent work since finishing with us. Again, seemed like madness at the time. Take on 106 new staff in the middle of a pandemic, but we did that. And when we had those 3 COVID cases and had to close that first time, we learned from that. We innovated even then and sent out $106,000 of food vouchers to feed every family that was meant to come in that week, and learned that we can't have a single point of failure. So when we reopened, we made sure to have rotating teams. All through this, agility and innovation was critical. All through this, not being afraid to double down on the hard decisions and to keep communicating them. I remember when we brought in masks, we brought them in a month before the government did. We brought in social distancing, sneeze guards, room limits. We saw the cliff that was coming. And that thing about remembering not to let your own conscious bias and your own ego and hubris to get the better of you, to remember what you don't know. And don't worry about the money. It will take care of itself if you live your purpose and show people that you are there when it matters more than ever before. And keep repeating that hard, boring stuff day in, day out, because the most critical thing people needed is to feel safe, to feel that their workplace cared about them. For our members, our clients, that we were still there for them when it mattered most. Trust, integrity, mission, purpose, doing what was right were the biggest lessons of this pandemic for us. And as CEO, I was going to hold the line, even when it was lonely and difficult sometimes, because I knew what was non-negotiable: our people, our values, our principles, and our purpose. We got to the end of the year, Christmas 2020. And how did we finish? No one lost their job. No one got laid off. No one got their hours cut. All our social enterprise staff were paid when there wasn't work for 6 months and more, and we continued into 2021. We had our most successful fundraising year ever, more support than ever before. We had 3 COVID cases and 0 community transmissions. We had no one die in our care. And we kept our doors open and have continued to through 5 lockdowns in Victoria and Australia. The biggest lessons I've learned as a leader: be brave, be courageous, be curious, stand with your team, make sure you're aligned on your values, your purpose, and what you stand for. And as this pandemic continues to roll out into 2021, we continue to practice the same principles. Doing the right stuff, do it hard, do it fast. Think about what our political leaders have done in that space. And don't be afraid to make those tough decisions and hold the line and keep holding it and holding it. Because what you're protecting is your purpose, your values, and your people. And you will never, ever regret that as a leader. Thank you.